Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Against the Odds. So last week on our Against the Odds poll, we had a bunch of standard options that we had never played before, and in the end, it was As Foretold pretty much dominating the field. It was so far ahead of everything else. However, we had to make a bit of an audible at the last minute. So as you can probably tell looking at this deck list, all these cards aren't standard legal. So we switched to modern, and we'll talk about why as we go along and break down our As Foretold for modern deck. First, a couple of quick reminders. For one, we're almost at 100k subs. If you haven't already, it would be awesome of you if you could click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. And also, if you want to vote for next week's Against the Odds deck, follow the link in the description to the article on the site. It's down below the video in the description box. You'll find a poll at the bottom of the article where you can vote for next week's option. Anyway, let's talk about As Foretold. So As Foretold itself is a potentially powerful enchantment. 3 mana, enters with 0 counters. Each turn, you get a time counter on it, and then during each turn, you can cast 1 card for free as long as its converted mana cost is less than the number of counters on As Foretold. So the first turn, you could cast something 0 mana. Second turn, 1 mana. Third turn, 2 mana. Also important to note that turn means your turn and then your opponent's turn. So if you have instants, you can cast something on your turn, and then during your opponent's turn, cast an instant. So you're kind of casting 2 things if the deck is built in that way. So, of course, as I mentioned before, initially the idea was to play As Foretold in Standard, and I really tried. Here are the things that I came up with that we could potentially do with As Foretold in Standard. We could be like a Rise from the Tides deck. The problem is, Rise from the Tides is 6 mana, so that's turn 3 As Foretold. Wait 6 more turns to cast a Rise from the Tides. We could have already just cast a Rise from the Tides by that time. We could also be some hardcore mono blue control deck, but that didn't sound very entertaining, where we could like use As Foretold to cast counters for free. Could also try to be a flash deck, flashing in like Elder Deep Fiends, Archangel Avacyn's, but again, there's so much mana. I just couldn't find a way to make playing As Foretold and then waiting to cast 5, 6, 8 mana cards be practical. So, basically, the bottom line is I couldn't figure out a way to make As Foretold entertaining and fun in Standard. There were ways we could have played it, but it would have been a miserable deck to watch. It would have been hardcore mono blue control with tons of counters and just basically trying to stall as long as possible, draw as many cards as possible, and then on turn like 20 or 30 or something, maybe win with Rise from the Tide. So it just wouldn't have been a very entertaining deck. However, there's some super sweet options in Modern, which make for an extremely interesting, entertaining, and potentially powerful deck. So the big deal with As Foretold in Modern is there's this entire cycle of cards with no mana cost, which for As Foretold counts as 0 mana. Which means as soon as we cast an As Foretold, we can cast one of these cards right away. So we have Ancestral Visions, which becomes an Ancestral Recall. We play As Foretold, we immediately can Ancestral Visions, draw 3 cards, super powerful. Drawing those cards helps us find Restore Balance, which is literal balance, a card that is banned everywhere. It is so busted. It makes people essentially empty their hand and sack their entire board, and we can build around it and our opponent won't expect it, so we just wreck people. And then Living End as a Wrath that can also get creatures back from our graveyard. So we are playing all of these free spells, 10 free spells in all. And the idea is we're going to find our As Foretold and we are going to cast a ton of free spells. And the interesting part is all these spells work a little bit differently. So let's break down how each of them works. So first off, Ancestral Visions just draws us a bunch of cards, and it helps us find our other free spells. It doesn't actually win us the game on its own, it can't kill our opponent, but it can help us find our cards that can kill our opponent. The Restore Balance plan is super sweet. So the main combo here is Greater Gargadon. We get that suspended, and then when we cast our Restore Balance for free with As Foretold, we can sacrifice all of our lands, which means our opponent is going to have to sacrifice all of our lands. And the great part about As Foretold is we still have it on the battlefield. Restore Restore Balance doesn't impact enchantments, so we still have an As Foretold. So even though we don't have any lands, even if our board is empty, we're naturally breaking the symmetry of Restore Balance because we can still cast stuff every turn with As Foretold and take over the game that way. Also, we've seen cards like Restore Balance work in the past, but there's a major deck building restriction because you need to cascade into them. Just suspending for 6 turns is way too slow, which means you can't play any 1 or 2 mana spells to cascade into Restore Balance. But in our deck, we actually get to play real cards and other free spells because we don't have that deck building restriction, which is really awesome. But Restore Balance into Greater Gargadon, sacking our lands, is kind of our primary way of winning the game. As far as actually closing out the game after Restore Balance, we got a couple of Planeswalkers. Nahiri just pluses a couple times, then it gets us our Emrakul, attacks our opponent, annihilates our board, closes out the game. And remember, we can always cast our Nahiri with our As Foretold. So as things are ticking up, we are going to be able to cast it even if we sacrifice all of our lands. Narset Transcendent does a couple of things. First, it generates a bunch of card advantage. It can rebound stuff like Ancestral Visions, which is pretty helpful. And it locks out non-creature permanents, so we just plus a few times, ultimate. That makes sure after our As Foretold for Restore Balance, we're not going to lose to lightning bolts and stuff like that off the top. So Living End gets rid of all the creatures on the battlefield, like a Wrath, but then puts all creatures from all graveyards into play, so we have a light reanimation theme. This is kind of a backup plan. We can use Living End just like a Wrath. Our opponent has a bunch of creatures. We don't really have that many creatures. We Living End, wipe away their board for free with As Foretold. We can also use Faithless Looting and Collector Brutality, which are helpful cards anyway. Faithless Looting digs through our deck to find our As Foretold, which is one of the big parts of this deck. We really need As Foretold for it to work. Collector Brutality lets us pick apart answers to As Foretold, Abrupt Decays, and so forth, kills early game creatures if we need to not die to the early rush, even gains us a bit of life. So we want these cards anyway, but they also let us discard things like Greater Gargadon or our Elish Norn, and then when we Living End, we get back our Greater Gargadon. It's massive, it's a 9/7, it's going to close out the game super quick, or our Elish Norn. So when we're not suspending Greater Gargadon, we can actually discard it and reanimate it with Living End and close out the game that way. So we have a bunch of different ways of making As Foretold awesome. The rest of the deck, Path, Serum Visions, mostly just support cards. We can cast them with As Foretold. It's pretty neat to be able to tap out for a Planeswalker and still pass something with As Foretold with just one counter on it. Serum Visions to find our As Foretolds. A few Border Posts, which work well with the Restore Balance plan. We're not overloaded on Border Posts. That's not really our main plan. We don't need to be overloaded. We don't need mana on the battlefield once we Restore Balance because we have As Foretold, so we don't really have any need for mana. But they still work well if we happen to be in some weird situation where As Foretold gets killed in response to Restore Balance. So because Restore Balance doesn't affect artifacts, it's the mana that stays on the battlefield after Restore Balance. As far as the mana base, Teleria West is key because it tutors up any of our free spells. So, want to draw some cards? We get our Ancestral Visions. Want to destroy our opponent and win the game? We get our Restore Balance. Need to Wrath or Reanimate? We get Living End. So it's a cheap, efficient, low opportunity cost, because it's also a land, way for us to find whatever free spell we need. Then we just have the typical fetch lands, shock lands, basic lands. As far as the sideboard, we get a bunch more removal for aggro decks. We get some Disruption, Thoughtseize to pick apart hands, Relic for graveyard, Stony Silence, Affinity, Leyline of Sanctity to stay alive through discard and burn, and then a couple of negates to fight combo decks and control decks, and that's As Foretold for Modern, and that's our Against the Odds deck for this week. So I'm super excited for this one. Is it going to work? I don't know, but we got a lot of cool stuff going on. Restore Balance is a busted card. Ancestral Visions is busted, Living End is busted, so I think when we have our As Foretold, this deck is going to just do some absurd things and be able to beat a lot of real decks. Just Restore Balance in specific is so incredibly broken as a Magic card, and I'm really excited to get to try out this build of it because we don't have the deck building restrictions. The biggest problem with Restore Balance, with Living End, is to make them work in Modern, you gotta warp your deck to such a great degree, but look at our deck, it's a real deck. We have Serum Visions, and Path to Exiles, and Faithless Lootings, and all this stuff that you couldn't play in a As Foretold Living End Restore Balance deck because of the Cascade plan. So we actually have a real plan and can play like a real deck where we kill our opponent's stuff and we dig to find our As Foretolds, which is really interesting that you can do that now with these free spells and had never been able to do it before. The biggest risk for the deck, I think, is that we just don't find our As Foretold, and our Restore Balances are much worse and Living Ends are much worse if we don't find Greater Gargadons. So we do have a couple of specific pieces that we need to find, but we have ways of finding them. We have removal to stay alive and discard to stay alive until we find them. So I think we're going to pick up some wins with the deck. Anyway, that's our Against the Odds deck for this week, As Foretold for Modern. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the gameplay videos, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you haven't already, take a minute and click that subscribe button. It's a great way to support the channel for free, and you'll find the next video in the playlist right here.